People who quit their jobs on the first day. What was your I'm out of here moment? Story 1. Technically the first day, but the second day. When I was 20 or so, I got hired to be a temporary floor member for Forever 21 during the holiday season. My training started a week before Black Friday, so the store was already kind of in chaos. On my first day of training, I walked in and the floor manager gave all the new hires a tour showing us the facility and the layout of the store. After this, I was reassigned to a veteran floor member to shadow and get an idea of what my job was and what my duties would be. As soon as I was assigned, the floor manager dipped, never to be seen again. An hour and a half into my shift, my shadowee got an emergency family call and had to take off for a week. This happened and I found some other floor managers and explained the situation and asked them who else I would shadow. The manager's response was, just do what you can by yourself, you'll be fine. Everyone else is busy. Figured, well, okay, I'll try. I don't know if any of you have shopped in the women's section of Forever 21, but during the seasonal sales, they will have multiple articles of clothing that all look almost exactly the same, but with slight differences. An example of which, a white cardigan with 4 buttons that looked literally the same as a white cardigan with 5 buttons. The best part was these different items were often placed in completely separate parts of the store. And it was the job of the dressing room to return the unpurchased items to the correct section, so the employees could put them back on the shelves. Well, these employees frickin' sucked, and I didn't know if they were part of my section or not, so I'd spend a ridiculous amount of time trying to find where they go before realizing, wait, this isn't even my section. I've checked literally every rack. So I'd put it back on the sorting rack and move on to the next item. More than 50% of the stuff I was told to reshelve wasn't my section. I just did as best as I could and got ready for my next miserable day. The next day I come in and the store manager pulls me to her office and tells me how slow I was the day before, and that if I want to keep working there, I need to be very fast. I explained my lack of training and unfamiliarity with the store, and she told me if I didn't know where the clothes were in sections, I should come in my free time and memorize where stuff was at. I spent the rest of my shift putting clothes in random freaking places, then never came back for a third shift. Screw that place and its management. Story 2. I was a cashier at Lowe's during college for less than a full day. I made it through the multiple day training, but there was so much stupid crap going on I almost thought I was in a hidden camera show. All of the employees complained about how hard they had to work while simultaneously not getting enough hours. Nobody understood why we were hiring 4 new people. I was one of those 4. Turns out it's because they were progressing through a sexual harassment complaint that required restructuring of the store and firing of some employees. This was known to HR and explained to new hires against company policy, but wasn't known to employees, apparently some of whom still worked there, including the frickin' person doing the training. She was really inappropriate and said not to worry about the sexual harassment stuff, that everything would go back to normal soon enough, and we wouldn't have to be so uptight. They fired her before the day I started, along with one of the cashiers who trained me. She also offered me terrible guidance for the application process. They were looking for part-time help, and for 2 of the 3 days they needed help, I had off from school. I told them I could work nights, most nights, but if they needed daytime help, it had to be on those days. She said if I was too restrictive, they wouldn't keep me on. Lied to my boss about my availability to make me even more attractive than I already was, wink, and told me to schmooze them a bit and I'd make it further. She said in the end it wouldn't impact anything, and I'd get those days. In my first week's schedule, I was working mornings every day that I was in school, and I wasn't given any hours on my days off. Aside from the fact that I was given 2 times the hours the position called for when other employees were shortened, my work schedule was literally impossible to consolidate with my school schedule. I only went to work on my first day to tell them I was quitting and that their application process was a freaking mess. They couldn't figure out how so much went wrong, and then they asked who trained me and everything made sense. They thanked me for at least showing up to quit, unlike the other 3 they hired who just stopped returning their calls and no-showed their first days. Story 3. My first ever job. I was 13 and I would be delivering phone books from the back of a van through people's letterboxes. so I'd be in the back of the van with the phone books, and there was an older guy driving slowly while I went back and forth to the van and houses with the books. At one point, the van was getting quite empty, so there was more space to move around, and we had finished the delivery in the street where we were paid to deliver to, and he drove to another. While driving there, he drove, let's say, aggressively, and I fell inside the back where the books were. I wasn't sitting in a seat as the van had no seats in the back. As I put my hand out to steady myself, I accidentally laid it across a portable radio that had its antenna extended, but the antenna was also broken halfway and razor sharp. It sliced the palm of my hand cleanly open, 3 to 4 inches. I can only describe what I saw as gruesome. I said to him to pull the van over and that I needed help. He saw my hand and just threw me a plastic bag, the kind you'd get at a supermarket, and told me to wrap my hand in it. Then he continued with the deliveries. At least he delivered the remaining books himself. I should have been taken to a hospital, or at least home to my parents. I quit after that and never showed up again. As you can imagine, my parents were quite angry at him. Story 4. I have worked in construction-type jobs my whole life. The amount of angry, abusive ass you encounter is endless. This one dickhead still has the title. This was in the 90s, so he has stood the test of time. A friend quit this job and gave my number to the ass boss he had, without my knowledge. I never did thank him for that. This guy calls me out of the blue and asks if I need work. I said I did. He said he could pick me up the next morning. I said I have my own car and that I could meet him on site. He yells and says he will pick me up. I was floored that this idiot was yelling at me 2 minutes after talking to me. I gave him my address and he said he would be there at 6:30 the next morning. At 5:30 the next morning, this ass is calling asking, "Where the hell is your house?" No hello, no good morning, just full-on screaming. I said if he would stop yelling, I would give him directions. He starts yelling again, so I hang up. He calls right back and is losing it because I hung up on him. I tell him to get off and not even bother showing up. The 2 other guys I lived with were now awake and not too happy with me. I explain what happened and they just go back to bed. About 30 minutes later, I am awakened by the sound of a horn blaring outside our house. We lived on a farm, so luckily the next door neighbor was half a mile away. My roommates once again wake up and they are livid. We all go outside and this crap is yelling at us to get in the truck because we're late. He's there half an hour earlier than he said he would be. He also doesn't know who is who because he just spoke to me on the phone. I'm about to tell him to screw off again, but my buddy walks up to the truck and says he wants to get paid up front. This guy lets loose a tirade on my buddy. My buddy just laughs in his face. He says if you're going to be an ass, he will have to pay him first. The guy just keeps yelling. My buddy says he will be out in a minute and he better have his money ready. We all go back in the house and watch this guy wait in his truck. He's there for about 5 minutes and starts blowing the horn. We just laugh and poke our heads out the door and say we'll be there in a minute. He keeps blowing the horn. We just ignore him. After another 10 minutes, he bangs on the door. I open the door and this fool is about 5'2" and maybe 200 pounds. I am shocked by his appearance. He's just about to say something and I say, "Didn't I tell you to go off and not bother coming here?" He is truly confused. He asked where's the other guy. I said he was just messing with you. I'm the guy you were talking to. Now go off. He says, "So you're going to mess me up and not come to work?" I was amazed at what an ass this guy was. I said you gotta pay me up front first. He starts yelling and swearing again. I slam the door in his face. He starts banging on the door like a madman. I finally get enough and get a hockey stick and chase him back to his truck. It was pretty funny watching him run. He backs out of the driveway and threatens he'll get me for this. He is, to this day, still the biggest ass I've ever met. Story 5. Had 2 interviews to work housekeeping at a hospital. Got a call the night of the second interview at around midnight from the guy saying, "I was just so excited I wanted to call and tell you I'm going to call you to offer you the job tomorrow." Should have taken that as the first red flag, but I needed the job. I go in for my first day of training and he has printouts of my Facebook wall and my boyfriend's and he starts asking me how long we've been together and made it clear he knew everything so as not to lie to him. It was very uncomfortable. I leave his office and do some training. We break for lunch and he sits with me in the cafeteria, asking how it's been so far, etc. Then tells me he expects to see me at his church this Sunday. I haven't gone to church in like 10 years at this point. We all had a quick meeting in our main room and I stayed back after everyone had left. I put my badge, keys, and walkie on the desk and walked the hell out. I felt bad, but it was no wonder why they couldn't keep anyone. He called me for months afterward asking what had happened. He was worried sick, he deserved answers, blah blah blah. I'd called their HR the day after I'd walked out to tell them I quit and why, so they had to have told him. He had no reason to keep contacting me. He was a Mormon. I had grown up around a lot of Mormons, so I never thought this was a normal thing for them, and I know it's definitely not for all of them. This happened 7 years ago. At the time, I was 20 and pretty naive. I was more concerned with finding a job to keep my apartment than I was thinking about escalating this. I had another part-time job at the time too. I told that boss about this and he pulled some strings and got me in full-time. I still have this job and I love it. It's where I met my husband too, actually. The hospital's HR person comes into my store a lot and she's really sweet. I think she hasn't been with the hospital for a few years now. Story 6. I got a job at a Build-A-Bear knockoff at the end of a mall that wasn't very busy. My interview with the owners was interesting. They were an older couple who said that they had wanted to open a Chick-fil-A, but they needed about $1 billion to do that. On my first day, one other girl was working, and she didn't really talk to me. I had basically no training and she disappeared into the back. I was standing at the register area, which was underneath a giant storybook mushroom. A mother and her young son walk in and start to look at the bearskin options. I greeted them and left them to look around. They ended up leaving after a couple of minutes and my coworker reappeared from the back with the cordless phone and handed it to me. It was my boss. He told me that when a customer walks in, he wants me to come out from under the mushroom to tell them, "Come out from the mushroom." After he finished speaking to me, I hung up and went to my coworker and asked about the phone call. She said this place has cameras set up and the owners watch them from their house and call in a lot. I did not come back to work after that day. Story 7. When I was 20, I worked at Wendy's. As fast food jobs go, it wasn't bad, but I always wanted to pick up some extra cash, so I decided to add a second job. I had washed dishes in a busy restaurant my senior year in high school, so I figured I could do that. I applied for a dishwasher job at a local IHOP, and I was hired. On my first night, I had a shift that was supposed to last until 3 a.m. I knew that was pushing it though, because I was scheduled to clock in at Wendy's at 9 a.m., but I figured I could slam a few hours of sleep, and I'd be fine. 3 a.m. came and went, and the guy who was supposed to relieve me never showed up. I ended up working until 6. By that time, there was no point in even going to bed, so I just chilled for a few hours at home and went to Wendy's to start my shift. I was lucky I didn't fall asleep behind the wheel on my way there and home. Later that evening, after I got some sleep, I drove down to IHOP and told them I quit. I decided it was better to stay alive than to make some extra money, and so far that decision has proven to be correct. Story 8. I did one shift at Bath & Body Works. First, I had to come in for like a 4-hour session of watching videos, and I'm not even sure I got paid for it. Then they told me to come in for the 4:30 to 8:30 shift. During the shift, I was chastised for not following customers who had asked to be left alone, told to try to grab children to put the new sparkly lotion on, and continually harassed to sell people things. When the store closed at 8:30, I was making conversation with a worker about closing. I had mentioned having to work at Toys R Us before and wanted to compare the closing times. She told me that they normally got out close to midnight. Have you ever been to one of these stores? There's no reason why a fully staffed store that size should take 4 hours to close. Told the manager not to even bother putting me on the schedule. She was surprised and gave me the stink eye for the remaining hour we were there. Ridiculous. Also, they insisted on abbreviating the store's name to BB&W. Say that, and then say Bath & Body Works. How many syllables did you save? Bonus story. I also did one shift at Steve Madden about 6 years later. They didn't tell me how to get into the building. It was a morning shift in a mall, and I'd explicitly asked if I would have to enter the building at a specific entry point. The music was blasted all day and hurt my ears. I was harassed all day long by the day manager to buy a pair of boots. We were required to wear a current pair of Steve Madden shoes for 6 months. I tried putting it off, but she wouldn't leave me alone. They were mad when I called to say I was quitting, And funny enough, I quit both places and worked at a pet store right after. They also tried to avoid paying me until the IRS got involved. Story 9. Calls. First off, they messed up the hiring pretty bad. A group of us spent an entire day trying to do the paperwork and whatnot. It was a hot mess and a huge red flag. But hey, I'd been out of a job for 7 months and I needed this. First official day. I'm spending the first half of my shift doing training videos. The amount of dread I felt from the videos constantly emphasizing how you must push the store credit card or you're fired made me uneasy. I mentally checked out when they went over how you'll be fired if you don't have so many sign-ups in a month. I wanted to run, but I really needed the money. I thought I'd transfer out of the cashier ASAP and be fine. After lunch, I did register for training. It was a stupid, slow day and I was expected to constantly be doing something. So I was bored out of my freaking mind. The trainer clocked out an hour into my training and I was pretty much left on my own with someone maybe walking by every now and again to check in. After my shift, I tried to talk to the manager about my possibilities. I had gotten another job offer and wanted to see if I could work a schedule out with both, but the manager wasn't there. I later got an angry voicemail ranting about how I wasn't allowed to work another job unless they worked around their 39.5-hour schedule. And I certainly couldn't do nights for the other company despite being scheduled all mornings that week. And how dare I'm even so bold to bring up this subject. I dropped an immediate resignation notice on her desk the next day and left. Screw calls. They're nothing but whip-cracking asses. Story 10. I got an entry-level job as an arborist at a local tree management service. I was in my early 20s, fresh out of college, and loved trees, so I was pumped to learn more about trees and learn how to trim and cut them down, etc. On my first day, I was put on a crew with 2 other dudes who were supposed to be my trainers. These 2 were pretty much knuckleheads. We only had the front seat of our truck to sit in as we drove to the jobs, and I had to sit in between both of them. They were laughing and playing jokes and messing around the whole day. So we got to an orchard where we were supposed to trim a few trees, and it just so happened that in one of those trees is a massive hornet's nest. The lead guy I was with thought it would be funny to vigorously shake the branch that the nest was hanging from. As you can imagine, he was immediately attacked by hornets and started running toward the truck. However, I and the other guy were between the lead guy and the truck, and once we saw the swarm, we bolted. I remember running through the orchard thinking, this is too bad. I quit. Story 11. Not my story, but my mom's. She left her previous large company looking for a change of pace as she approaches retirement and thought she'd found the ideal place. Small, in a field she was already familiar with, and family-owned. Due to her expertise and general view on underqualified management, she explicitly told the owners, father and son, that she could not work with micromanagement, and the more agency she has, the better work they'll see. They happily told her it wasn't a problem. The previous person who had her job was sticking around for 5 business days to show my mom their systems. At that time, she found out every system was outdated by nearly 25 years. Her job including taking attendance of the employees, adults, and publicly posting the sheet on a board. There were weekly all-hands meetings on what everyone was up to. During these meetings, the father relentlessly belittled everyone in their work and personal life. Every second that the previous employee wasn't showing her what to do for the job was filled with horror stories confirming that micromanagement was the only constant at the company. High turnover due to hostile work conditions. My mom's true final straw was when the son who owned the company called her at the end of the day to make sure she was leaving on time. Twice on consecutive days. She ended her employment with them on the second call after 3 days of working there. Story 12. I put in to do transaction work for a company that sounded really good on paper, and they were enthusiastic to hire me. They told me they just had to do a test run first to see how I'd do it, and that they would pay me for my work. Okay, no problem. I had a few years as a transcriber and document preparer working for an attorney, so the work they wanted or described to me was very familiar. Nothing new at all. What they sent me was a really crappy audio file with a guy who had a thick accent and microphone feedback, so I could barely hear anything he said. The file was over half an hour and an hour long too, not 15 minutes as they'd said they would send. I transcribed 15 minutes, then sent it back stating that I hadn't transcribed the whole thing since per the original instructions, it was only 15 minutes they wanted. I waited, and a half hour later, I got my transcript back marked up with all kinds of errors. Not mine, theirs. The punctuation was wrong, the content I knew and could hear was not what the person on the tape said, etc. I also got a contract attached to the statement. I agreed to be dinged, 25 cents deducted from my invoice for every error found following, along with a promise I would never badmouth the company. I blocked them immediately and ignored their repeated attempts to contact me over the next few days, blocking each contact until they gave up trying to reach me. I know a con job when I see one. Story 13. My very first job was at a little drive-in restaurant close to my high school. I showed up to work the first day. The lady said I had to pay her $50 for training. She showed me around the place and said that my pay would be $4.50 an hour as a car hop. This was in 2010, and all the tips I made went into a bucket with all the other girls' tips. At the end of the night, she counted up the tips, kept 20% for herself, and split the rest up evenly among every employee. Also, part of our job was 1 day a week we had to spend 4 hours cleaning her house. I literally left after listening to her go over all these rules. My dad was pissed until I explained, and another girl confirmed, and my dad agreed I did the right thing. Story 14. Went into an Italian restaurant for my first day of work and got 3 red flags on the very first day. Number 1. The manager said he had lots of hours for me and that getting shifts would be no problem. Every single other employee told me that they were struggling for hours and that they had no idea why they hired me. Number 2. Everyone said the manager was an ass, even the customers. Number 3. It was my first day there and I actually had to teach the woman training me how to do 1 or 2 things.